Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Avorion episode 60. I'm Enigmius, and today we're continuing with the Chariot carrier build. We've got all kinds of different places where we could be working now. We've got the back end, which as you can see has been filled with a certain amount of equipment since the last episode, mostly just for the sake of stuffing it in there to see what we could make fit. We've got the middle section here, which is what we just started to work on, that is going to have that sort of cavity that I was talking about previously, where you've basically got the front section of the ship and the back section of the ship, and in between there's going to be just a bunch of structural stuff that doesn't have the same heft as the rest of the hull design. We've still got a bunch of stuff on the front end that we need to finish off as well, but it seemed to make sense to address this middle section a little bit so that we can line up a lot of the things that we need to line up between the front and the back and get that taken care of before we start making any serious moves to complete this structure on either the fore or the aft sections. So this idea sort of came to me thinking in terms of how we can add visual interest to the ship that's slightly functional, but primarily just there for the looks, that would help to balance things out a little bit in terms of the appearance without interfering with this idea that the center of the ship is basically not there. So we've got sort of a, I don't even know necessarily what to call it. It's just like this, it's like a flat, wide arm that's sticking out from the top part of the ship, and it's going to kind of slope forward. As you can see, we're just beginning the process of doing that, and then it's going to come back underneath and come together on the underside of the ship. And then once that's done, then that gives us the main point that if we were going to do any more connecting between the front and the back, that's where it would pass through, is this element that we're putting into place now. So there was significance in choosing to do this at this point in time, as opposed to leaving it till towards the end or finishing the front or the back first. With regards to the equipment that we've added, just because I was kind of messing around and decided to throw in a bunch of stuff just to see how things would fit. And it's also kind of interesting as well at various different points in a build to see how the different things that we can add are capable of influencing the ship at that point in its development. Speaking specifically of things like thrusters, generators, how much space do we need to have allocated for generators if we want the ship to have enough power, etc., etc. And then also seeing those numbers that we've established for the various different performance categories of the ship sort of diminish as we continue to add mass. But the key here was to put ourselves in a position where we could test some of these things and have a reasonable idea of what was going on. So we had to add generators, we had to add some directional thrusters. We've got crew quarters, that spine that's basically going across the top of the ship. I stuffed crew quarters in there, so basically they're highly vulnerable, but they've got one of the best views in the house, realistically speaking, if we were to give them any windows. And with those things in place, we can sort of add crew and add various different functional components and get an idea of how things are going to perform as we go, rather than putting ourselves in a position where we've got a more or less complete ship and we try and put everything in place and find out that we didn't have enough room, or we didn't create enough space in sort of key areas for things like directional thrusters that want to be on the outer extents of the ship, etc., etc. It just makes sense to have a little bit in place now, even if it's not by any stretch of the imagination the completed ship. And that also includes structural integrity field generators, putting those in place while we remember, before we put ourselves in a position where we have to start adding them to the outside of the ship because we didn't really leave any room on the inside, and we need some in certain locations. But you get the idea now, what I was referring to about this structural thing that just kind of extend outwards and then slopes forward and then kind of comes back together on the underside. And one of the things that I wanted to add to this to make it a little bit more interesting and kind of suggest that it's not just purely cosmetic but slightly functional is a slightly widened section that you see is going in now, to which we're going to attach some thrusters, just generic propulsion thrusters. At some point, we may switch them out for directional thrusters, depending on how much thrust we get out of the back end of the ship when we start taking that on. I had originally sort of considered that we would have some of our directional thrusters attached to this part of the ship, because it would be a reasonable place to put the roll thrusters. If we wanted the ship to be able to roll fairly well, all things considered, that would be one of the most logical places to put it, because it's out to the sides as far as anything else on the ship is extended. So, like I said, we may change it at some point in the future. We may not. It just kind of depends on how things get together. The thing with this ship, as opposed to the other ones that we've built, is that I'm not really too insistent that this one have good handling characteristics. We haven't always had the best handling characteristics in the ships that we've made in the past, because it was a learning process. We were just kind of putting things together, and then when it gets around to the tuning and the tweaking, I only go so far with it before it's like, okay, this one's done, I want to get on to the next build. But in this case, being that it's a carrier, being that most of its offense is based on the whole idea of fighters of various different kinds, and the only maneuverability that realistically we should absolutely need for a ship of this nature is to get our point defense turrets in line with whatever the threats may be. And in that case, you don't necessarily want a lot of maneuverability, because sometimes turrets in this game can take an awful long time to track, and it's actually to your benefit to move a little bit less and just let the turrets track on their own if you have good enough coverage on the hull so that you can reach anything that's coming toward you from any direction. You don't need to be maneuvering around anyway. So as long as we can turn at a reasonable rate, so that when we're navigating, when we're trying to get from point A to point B, lining up with the next jump gate, doing whatever we need to do, you don't feel like you're stuck waiting on this massive ponderous ship that's not moving hardly at all, then we should be okay. And I think that we're going to be in a pretty good spot once we get around to that point where we'll be able to maneuver as well as we need. And then the only question is, will we have the thrust to get the ship going up to speed in a way that actually lets you get from point A to point B without losing your mind. So the various different things that we're going to have to consider aren't necessarily going to hinge around the best possible location for directional thrusters, because we don't necessarily need them as badly as we would in some other ship designs. So here we're just kind of finishing off this area where we've placed the thrusters, just to kind of finish it off a little bit, give it sort of a completed look. We've got some bevels here and there and some chamfers and all that other stuff that makes things look a little bit more deliberate. And now we're adding the ubiquitous structural integrity fields. I'm still trying to get the hang of specifically how it determines what is covered in terms of directions from the blocks or whatever it happens to be. Really what it amounts to at this point in time is just sticking the blocks wherever we need them until we get the coverage that we want, without necessarily understanding in exacting detail how that coverage is calculated. So we got that section done. We got and I'm really happy with the way it turned out. It's got just a little bit of curve in various different places, but it's also got a bit of angularity, which I think is good. Given the rounded things that we have elsewhere on the ship, it's nice to have a little bit of angularity just for contrast. And now I wanted to have another narrow structural section that extends from the front of the ship and lines up with the piece that we just put in. I don't know necessarily if we'll continue that element all the way to the back end. But the key here, before I was able to do a whole lot to finish off the front end, was I had to get this piece in place, because I'm going to have to build around it when we do the last parts of the front end, closing it all in and finishing it off. So this, as you may guess, is a little bit tricky to get everything lined up, because we've got really not a lot of reference points that we can use to determine exactly where things are going to come together. And I want, just like we had in the top section, I want this to have just a soft kind of curve coming from the front towards the back, and it becomes less and less noticeable as you get towards this center section. So getting this built in a way that we got the right curve and got everything to line up the way that I wanted it to. It took a little bit of fiddling and a little bit of kind of placing things and seeing where they line up, making some adjustments, seeing where those line up, etc. This was simple enough that it was enjoyable. Sometimes it's a little bit less so enjoyable just because of the nature of the task, but we're not talking about a lot of different blocks that we're having to remove and replace in order to make things work. We're still dealing with fairly large blocks. So it took a little bit longer than what I've shown you here. I've edited out a lot of the attempts to get everything to line up that didn't quite work. But in the end, I was pretty happy with how this wound up as well. I like the way the ship is coming together. I like that when you look at it, it's definitely got some bulk to it. It's definitely got some mass, and we'll continue to kind of build that out a little bit as we continue forward, especially in the front and the rear sections. We're not going to make it a whole lot wider. I think both areas are about where I want them in terms of width. A little bit wider just to kind of fill things out, I'm okay with, but I don't feel the need to expand it any further. I neglected to mention when we did that central section, the beginning of the video, and we put the thrusters on there. If you look at the thrusters from the back of the ship, they're actually out far enough from the rest of the ship that if there were theoretically any kind of wash effect, you know, the heat or the energy coming from the thrusters extending backwards, it would just barely pass by the sides of the rear portion of the ship. It wouldn't actually be contacting them. I like doing that, even if the game's rules don't require it, because I think it just makes more sense to me when I look at the ship and it's designed that way. On the other hand, if you were to look at the way that I place the directional thrusters in the front section of the ship, you would realize that it's not necessarily a hard and fast rule of mine, that if the game allows us to place things in a way where the parts that aren't supposed to be obstructed end up being obstructed anyways, I'm kind of okay with it from time to time. It's just one of those things. It's very subjective. Sometimes I like to follow the rules, even if they're the rules that I make. But most of the time, it's nice to be a little bit flexible. I think it's a balance between being a little bit overly pedantic and being a little bit reckless. Maybe find a middle ground there. This part here that I'm messing around with, I'm trying to find out how to best manage this transition, because we've got this slightly forward sloped bottom section that is meeting up with this part coming down from the front, and it's not making itself easy. It's I wasn't the happiest about the way that particular lower section turned out in the first place, but then trying to get everything to transition properly together took a little while. You saw that. So I think we're making good progress. I really like the way the ship is looking at this point, and there's a fair bit left to do in order to finish it off. But the next episode, we're going to pick up from here. We're going to be working somewhere. We've got a lot of different places that we can be focusing our attention, and we'll just kind of pick one and go with it. So that will be the next episode. If you want to be notified about that and future episodes in this and other series, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.